Hi, it's Thursday, October 30th, Friday the 31st in the Philippines. We've got a few systems to discuss in the tropics today. We've got Hurricane Melissa in the western Atlantic, now racing off to the northeast and is forecast to bring tropical storm and hurricane force winds to Bermuda throughout the night tonight. And in the Western Pacific, we've got a couple of disturbances to watch in the Philippine Sea. The first one is going to be 98W, and then we'll have another disturbance likely behind it, and those may have odds of developing in their own right over the next week, and we'll have to watch those for the next few days. But we'll talk about these in a little bit. We're going to start in the Atlantic with Hurricane Melissa, and I know I said yesterday that yesterday's video would probably be my last video on Hurricane Melissa, but there has been some further track trends for Atlantic Canada that I want to talk about with this system as it continues tracking to the northeast. Now, if we look how the system is doing this afternoon, we can see a little bit more of a disheveled hurricane. The system is now accelerating off to the northeast and is now moving into cooler waters as it heads further north. We talked about it for the past few days that a benefit of being in late October now is that sea surface temperatures have really cooled down in the western Atlantic. So you see near Bermuda, waters are in general 24 to 25 degrees Celsius. And for a hurricane, you generally need about 26 degrees Celsius waters. And you see right now, the hurricane is practically crossing over that isotherm this afternoon. And we have likely seen it cross over now. If we look at the recon data that we got from a NOAA plane that just left out of the storm a little bit ago, while they did find some pretty fierce winds on the eastern side, the pressure had started to rise, where the initial value, which is not shown here, was about 965 millibars. The final value was around 970 millibars. So the pressure is rising, indicating a weakening trend that is likely starting to occur. And the winds at the surface are not as strong as this plot would tell you. These are winds at flight level, and it does not seem like they're mixing well down to the surface. We probably just have more Cat 1 to Cat 2 force winds at surface, which is still pretty potent, but a little bit weaker than the category 3 or category 4 force winds that the plane was flying or finding at flight level. And so as the system continues to accelerate off to the northeast, it will likely not have a lot of time to lose intensity much. So we'll still likely see the system bring hurricane force winds to Bermuda tonight. You can see this happen if we look at the HASS model, and you'll see that Bermuda is here and they're well within the tropical storm force wind field, which is in green, and getting very close to the hurricane force wind field there in purple. And even if you don't get into that sustained wind field of hurricane force winds, these outer bands, especially in the stronger tropical storm force zone, could easily bring some hurricane force gusts to the island. So it's going to be a pretty nasty night as the system comes through tonight. But the benefit is that the system is accelerating in speed as we go in time. So even though we are going to be dealing with yet another hurricane this season in Bermuda, this one is going to be very quick. So you see that it starts impacting the island by this evening going into tonight. You can see by 11 p.m. local time, we're now in the tropical storm force wind field. But if we go to 8 a.m. local time tomorrow morning, we're now out of the tropical storm force wind field there. So it's going to be a very quick type system, and hopefully that can mitigate the amount of damage that the system might normally do if it was moving a little bit slower. And weather conditions tomorrow afternoon will be much better comparatively as more drier air pushes into the region for Halloween evening. Now, the same can't be said for Halloween evening in Newfoundland in Atlantic Canada. The system will be racing further northeast going into Friday and into Saturday, completing post-tropical transition likely before it gets there. So we're not looking at a hurricane making landfall in Newfoundland, but it could still, as a post-tropical cyclone, still have some pretty potent winds as it comes up here. You can see it here on the HASS model, still pretty strong tropical storm force winds, and this might be a little bit weak. The current Hurricane Center forecast still has hurricane force winds on the southeastern side of this hurricane, or post-tropical cyclone by this point, as it makes its closest approach. Now, the HASS model here is one of the more eastward solutions that we have today. Some models over the past day have suggested that the core of the system could come over land, and if that does occur, that does mean that these stronger winds may come on shore. So we may see a pretty strong period of winds here across the southeastern coast of Newfoundland, and that's likely to ruin Halloween evening plans, unfortunately, as it comes through. But some good news here is that, similar to Bermuda, it's going to be moving pretty quickly by this point. So you'll see that by Saturday afternoon into Sunday morning, we see the system move further northeast, and winds have not fully calmed down because we do have another area flow pressure, but they're definitely less in magnitude than it would be with X Melissa by that point. And that's the current Hurricane Center forecast, really. We have a hurricane warning in effect for Bermuda naturally as the hurricane passes very close to the island today. And then you can see turning post-tropical indicated by that white dot there in the forecast going into Friday evening and into Saturday morning. But you can see the H there is still showing hurricane force winds in the forecast by this point. And again, if we do see the center of the storm come onshore, that could put a lot of those more potent winds onshore. So we're likely to see a very nasty Halloween night into the start of November there. But the good news is, again, it's moving pretty fast by that point. And after that, it will be moving into the far North Atlantic. And going into next week, it could impact Iceland and the UK and Ireland as a non-tropical cyclone. Okay, that is all for Melissa and likely the last bit I have to talk about with Melissa with that system. For the next couple of weeks, like I talked about yesterday, we're probably going to be focusing solely in the Western Pacific as we've got a couple of disturbances to watch over the next few days. The first one is going to be Invest 98W, which is spinning here in the Philippine Sea. You can get a little bit of sense of rotation with some scattered convection going on over this. And we're likely seeing now the wind shear start to decrease over the system. We still likely have some. You can see some of these upper level cirrus clouds coming out of the southwest, likely highlighting the eastern side of an upper level trough, which is still sitting here to the north of the disturbance. But over the next few days, this trough is forecast to continue weakening, and by this weekend, the system is forecast to be left with a fairly light shear environment, which will likely lead to tropical cyclogenesis. Now, as we go into the forecast for the system, we talked about two distinct scenarios on model guidance yesterday. One was the GFS, which showed the system quickly forming into a typhoon this weekend and rapidly intensifying into a strong typhoon by landfall by Monday or Tuesday of next week. And we talked about how that was likely a bit too aggressive because that's a common bias of the GFS. It typically does overdo convection in storms, especially weaker storms like this, and that tends to lead to more aggressive forecasts in the model. And the other solution was the European, which was very weak, didn't really have the system forming for at least a week sitting in the Philippine Sea. And then in 10 days, we had the system actually making landfall in the northern Philippines as a strong typhoon. And we also talked about how that was a common bias of the European and how that was likely not the right scenario either, because that is, again, a common bias of the European to go way too weak with these systems. Now, in the overnight runs, or I guess it would be overday local time, we saw the GFS and European come into a bit better agreement on the scenario for the system. You can see the GFS out to Monday afternoon local time has a strong tropical storm to low-wind typhoon coming into the central or southeastern Philippines by this point. And it's a far cry from the strong typhoon that it had shown in prior forecasts. And it seems like this had been correcting from its stronger solutions yesterday. And what we also saw on the European run from 6Z is that it actually trended more to the GFS and showed a, again, stronger tropical storm or low-wind typhoon coming into the central or southeastern Philippines on this forecast. Now, since this run, this is the 6Z run, the 12Z run has trended back to the very weak scenario. And there may be reason to believe the European there, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the other disturbance. But I think overall, this kind of a scenario that these runs of the GFS and European are showing are the most likely scenario by this point. It seems likely that we'll see the system try to form this weekend as vertical shear decreases. You can see it here by this point. This is out to tomorrow afternoon local time. And by this point, the trough is virtually degraded away. And so vertical shear is very light by this point. And we'll likely see, especially given how the structure is right now, the system attempting tropical cyclogenesis. And I suspect that will occur, and as it moves towards the west, it will likely be limited in the amount of intensification that we see. So talking there about the GFS scenarios of a strong typhoon yesterday being a little bit too unrealistic because we do have moderate shear by this point. You can see we have light flow at the surface and stronger flow in the mid to upper levels, causing a significant speed shear here, which may keep the system from rapidly intensifying as it tracks towards the west. Now, of course, there is still uncertainty in this forecast. Even with the GFS and European agreeing in this, they are about a day delayed. So the GFS comes in on a Monday afternoon local time. The European comes in at Tuesday afternoon. So small details in the future of the system need to be worked out, and that will be worked out in really real time. We have to see how the system is developing in reality. but I think the most likely scenario is that we see again a tropical storm forming this weekend and going into early to mid next week. We see the system near the Philippines, and we could see some impacts in the form of rainfall and tropical storm force winds impact the Philippines by that point. Now, I mentioned a scenario where the weaker European solutions could be correct with the second disturbance behind it. And first, I need to mention that there is likely to be another disturbance behind Invest 98W. This is a GFS out to, again, Monday morning local time. And you can see by this point, 98W is nearing the coast of the Philippines. But if you look behind it, southeast of Guam, which is here, we'll see another disturbance taking shape. Further east. And this has led to some uncertainty, especially in European forecasts. For the interaction that this could have with 98W, say we have a scenario where the system does not intensify or develop as quickly as, say, maybe anticipated with the light shear this weekend. With a lighter flow that we have near the surface, that would mean that the system is not going to make all too much progression towards the west. And that's important thing to note with this is that the development of the system is going to be significantly tied to the eventual forward motion of the system. That's why in the GFS and European, we still have such a significant time difference on when landfall occurs. It's because in short term, the structure of the system is different on both of these models. And if the system is weaker, say it is not developing into a tropical storm this weekend, that means it may still be here southwest of Guam by the point this disturbance southeast of Guam is now coming into the scene. And so what the European has shown in its most recent run is a scenario where these disturbances now just get too close to each other and they end up interacting with each other, which ends up disrupting the potential for development out of either of these systems. Now, we may eventually still get development. In fact, that does occur on the European model. Up to about 7 days out. You can see it going up to a week out on this forecast. We still have this broad circulation, but beyond that, it starts to form into a storm as it tracks towards the northwest. But that could delay by a significant margin the time when we actually see development occur, especially because this is a broader area of flow pressure that these models are showing, and that alone does cause some more time needed for development to take place. Now, say in a scenario we have like the GFS, where it does develop this weekend, and by this point, it's over here by the Philippines. In that scenario, this system would likely be starting to get into a favorable environment by this time. You'll see on the GFS upper little flow plot, again, here's 98W by this point. And this disturbance is starting off fairly similarly to what we have with Invest 98W. We have this trough over this part of the Pacific, which is shearing the system initially. But this trough weakens over time, and eventually the system is left with a fairly light shear environment that allows it to form into a tropical storm on the model, where it could impact the Mariana Island chain by the time as it tracks towards the northwest on the model. But exact details on that are very uncertain because we still have a lot of uncertainty in the forecast with 98W, and really we're just gonna have to watch this in real time. And what we really need to see is how does the system perform, say, starting tomorrow once the vertical shear decreases. If we start to see the system forming into a tropical storm, then that clears up a lot of answers for both of these disturbances. But if it ends up being a bit weaker, despite that lower shear, then that will cause a lot more questions to be raised for both of these disturbances. So we'll have to watch these a lot for the next week or two. The good news is we have a lot of time to watch this in not only the Philippines, but also the Mariana Island chain. It's a long time before these systems would potentially impact these islands. You can see on the forecast here from the GFS, it impacts the Philippines by early next week, and then this system potentially impacts these islands by middle of next week. So lots of time to watch these, and I'll continue to have videos on these as they progress. But that's all I've got for today. Stay safe in Bermuda as Melissa comes by tonight, and same case in Newfoundland as it passes up there on Halloween evening. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.